The morning sun had barely peeked through the large windows at Atlanta International Airport's Terminal B when Mr. Anderson, a distinguished Air Force veteran with salt and pepper hair, made his way to Gate B-23. His one military-issued duffel bag, covered with patches from his years of service, hung heavily on his shoulder. At 52, he carried himself with the same dignity and discipline that had earned him numerous commendations during his 25 years of service. Flight 2317 to Washington, D.C. was already busy with passengers when he stepped aboard. The usual shuffle of travelers finding their seats filled the narrow aisle as Mr. Anderson looked for his seat in row 15. His duffel bag, though within the airline's size limits, was stuffed with gifts for his grandchildren, hand-picked treasures from his recent travels that made the bag slightly bulkier than usual. As he reached his row, he noticed the overhead compartment was already partially filled with a designer suitcase and several smaller bags. With careful movements, he tried to rearrange the items to make space for his duffel bag. His military training had taught him to be mindful of others' belongings, so he handled each item with care. "Sir, you need to hurry up. You're holding up the line," came a sharp voice from behind him. Ms. Wilson, a flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform, stood with her hands on her hips. Her badge indicated she'd been with the airline for 15 years, but her tone carried none of the professional courtesy her experience should have brought. Mr. Anderson turned slightly, offering a polite smile. "I apologize, ma'am. I'm just trying to make sure everything fits properly without damaging anyone's belongings." The line of passengers behind him had indeed grown, but most seemed understanding, with several nodding in agreement with his careful approach. However, Ms. Wilson's patience had apparently run thin. Without warning, she pushed forward, her shoulder forcefully connecting with Mr. Anderson's arm as she reached for the bag herself. The unexpected contact caught him off guard, causing him to stumble backward. His duffel bag slipped from his grasp, nearly hitting a young mother holding her baby in the next row. The cabin fell silent for a moment before erupting in concerned murmurs. A businessman in row 14 had already pulled out his phone, recording the incident. An elderly woman gasped audibly, while a college student a few rows back called out, "Hey, that's not right." Mr. Anderson steadied himself against the seat, his military training kicking in as he maintained his composure. Despite the flash of discomfort across his face, he remained dignified. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I don't believe that was necessary or professional." Ms. Wilson's face flushed, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "If you'd moved faster, this wouldn't have happened. Now, either take your seat or I'll need to call security." More phones emerged from the crowd of onlooking passengers. A quiet business traveler in first class was already typing an email to the airline's customer service. Through the window, the morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin, highlighting the tension in the air. Mr. Anderson took a deep breath, the same way he taught young airmen to do in tense situations. "I'd like to speak with your lead flight attendant, please," he requested, his voice steady and professional, carrying the weight of someone who'd handled far more stressful situations during his military career. The other passengers watched intently as this scene unfolded, many of them shaking their heads in disapproval at Ms. Wilson's behavior. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, why is the lady being mean to the nice man?" The incident might have seemed small to some, just another tense moment during the stressful boarding process. But as phones continued recording and passengers exchanged knowing looks, it was clear this moment would have consequences far beyond this flight. What Ms. Wilson didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was just how far those ripples would spread, especially once they learned about Mr. Anderson's son. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the Atlanta sky, promising a day that would unfold in ways none of them could have predicted when they first arrived at the airport that morning. The tension in the aircraft cabin grew thicker than the morning Atlanta humidity. Mr. Anderson stood quietly, one hand resting on the back of seat 15C, while concerned passengers continued recording the unfolding situation on their phones. His decades of military service had taught him that the loudest voice isn't always the strongest one. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, watched wide-eyed from his window seat as other passengers began speaking up. "I saw everything," called out a middle-aged teacher from row 17. He was being completely reasonable with his bag. Several others nodded in agreement, their murmurs of support growing louder. Ms. Wilson's perfectly pinned hair seemed to bristle as she realized more passengers were filming. "Everyone needs to take their seats immediately," she announced, her voice carrying a slight tremor despite her attempt at authority. "We're delaying our departure time." "We're delayed because you pushed a veteran," came a clear voice from the back. The comment rippled through the cabin, causing more passengers to turn and stare at the flight attendant. Someone near the front started typing furiously on their phone, the clicking of their keyboard adding to the tense atmosphere. Mr. Anderson adjusted his collar, where his Air Force veteran pin caught the morning light streaming through the windows. "Ma'am," he addressed Ms. Wilson again, his voice carrying the patience of someone who'd briefed generals and trained young airmen, "I'm simply requesting to speak with your lead flight attendant. This situation can be resolved professionally." A businessman in an expensive suit lowered his phone and leaned forward. "I've already emailed my corporate travel department. This is completely unacceptable behavior from airline staff." His words carried the weight of someone who likely booked hundreds of thousands of miles of travel annually. Ms. Wilson's face flushed deeper as she reached for her interphone, her hands noticeably shaking. "I'm calling security," she threatened, though her voice had lost its earlier edge. "You're disrupting the flight." "The only disruption I've seen is you pushing this gentleman," spoke up an elderly woman knitting in the aisle seat. She set her needles down and peered over her reading glasses. "I may be old, dear, but my eyes work just fine." The aircraft's air conditioning hummed steadily in the background as more passengers began sharing their videos online. A college student wearing a university sweatshirt held up her phone. "It's already got 100 shares on social media," she announced. "People are tagging the airline." Mr. Anderson remained calm, though anyone looking closely might have noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. He'd faced discrimination before, at stores, in restaurants, even once at a military ceremony, but he'd always handled it with the dignity his parents had instilled in him and the discipline the Air Force had reinforced. A flight attendant from first class, wearing a senior crew pin, finally made her way down the aisle. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her experienced eyes taking in the scene, the numerous recording phones, the agitated Ms. Wilson, and the composed veteran standing in the aisle. Before anyone could respond, a passenger who had been quietly observing from row 12 suddenly sat up straighter. He'd been scrolling through his phone, reading comments on the already viral videos. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I recognize you from the White House Memorial Day ceremony. You're not just any veteran." The cabin grew quiet as passengers leaned forward, sensing there was more to this story than a simple boarding dispute. Ms. Wilson's face, which had been red with anger, began to pale as whispers started circulating through the plane. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor, like fingers pointing toward an unavoidable truth that was about to emerge. Mr. Anderson's expression remained neutral, but those closest to him noticed his shoulders straighten ever so slightly. In his years of service, he'd learned that sometimes the most powerful response was simply standing your ground with dignity. As the whispers grew louder and more phones turned in his direction, it became clear that this incident was about to take a turn that no one, especially Ms. Wilson, had expected. The senior flight attendant looked between the increasingly nervous Ms. Wilson and the dignified veteran, realization dawning on her face as passengers began sharing their discoveries in hushed but excited tones. The story was about to expand far beyond a simple dispute over a duffel bag, and the truth about Mr. Anderson's connection to Washington would soon make this minor incident into national news. The passenger from row 12 stood up, his eyes bright with recognition. "You're Dr. Thompson's father, aren't you?" "The President's chief medical advisor." His words cut through the cabin noise like a lighthouse beam through fog, causing heads to turn and conversations to halt mid-sentence. A wave of realization swept through the aircraft. Several passengers quickly opened their phones, searching for images to confirm what they'd just heard. Sure enough, there were photos from recent White House events showing Mr. Anderson standing proudly beside his son, Dr. Thompson, one of the most respected medical voices in the country. "Oh my goodness," gasped a nurse in row 16, recognition dawning on her face. "Dr. Thompson spoke at our hospital's conference last month. He mentioned his father was a decorated Air Force veteran." She turned to her seatmate, speaking in an excited whisper. "He's revolutionizing our entire healthcare system." Ms. Wilson's face, already pale, now took on an ashen quality. Her hands, which had been firmly planted on her hips, dropped limply to her sides as the magnitude of her actions began to sink in. The senior flight attendant beside her took a small step back, already anticipating the storm that was about to break. "I watched Dr. Thompson's speech to Congress last week," called out another passenger, his voice filled with admiration. He talked about how his father's military service inspired his dedication to improving veteran healthcare. The comment sparked a fresh wave of phone activity as passengers began sharing the story on their social media accounts. Mr. Anderson remained standing quietly, his dignity intact despite the growing commotion around him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same measured tone he used throughout the incident. "My son's position shouldn't matter," he said softly, though in the hushed cabin, everyone could hear him clearly. "Every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or who they know." His words hit home harder than any angry outburst could have. Several passengers nodded solemnly, and a few were visibly moved by his response. A young veteran in military fatigues near the back of the plane stood up and offered a respectful salute. The senior flight attendant stepped forward, finally taking control of the situation. "Mr. Anderson, please accept our sincerest apologies for this incident. We'll be documenting everything thoroughly, and I assure you this will be addressed at the highest levels." Her voice carried genuine concern and professionalism that had been notably absent from Ms. Wilson's approach. Meanwhile, social media was exploding. A college student holding her phone announced, "The video's gone viral." Major news networks are already picking it up. The hashtags #respect to veterans and #Dr. Thompson's father were trending, with thousands of shares and comments pouring in by the minute. Ms. Wilson, who had been standing frozen in place, suddenly seemed to shrink into herself. The realization that she had not only mistreated a veteran, but had also physically confronted the father of one of the nation's most prominent public health figures appeared to hit her all at once. Her earlier bravado evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sun of scrutiny. A distinguished-looking woman in first class, who turned out to be a state senator, was already on her phone. "Yes, I'm witnessing it firsthand," she spoke into her device. "The airline needs to make this right, and quickly. This is about more than just one incident. It's about how we treat our veterans, our elderly, and frankly, every passenger who boards these planes." The senior flight attendant, reading the gravity of the situation, made a quick decision. "Ms. Wilson, please proceed to the front of the aircraft," she directed quietly but firmly. Then, turning to Mr. Anderson, she asked, "Would you prefer to speak with our ground supervisor before we depart? We can arrange that immediately." Mr. Anderson glanced at his watch, thinking of his grandchildren waiting in Washington. "That won't be necessary," he replied graciously. "I just want to get to my family." His response, marked by restraint and understanding, seemed to touch everyone who heard it. As Ms. Wilson made her way to the front of the plane, passengers could see her hands trembling. The weight of her actions, and their consequences, was clearly setting in. Some passengers watched her with obvious disapproval, while others simply shook their heads sadly at how quickly one person's bias and impatience had escalated into a national incident. The morning light continued to stream through the airplane windows, now illuminating a very different scene from the one that had begun just minutes earlier. As Mr. Anderson finally took his seat, the duffel bag safely stored with the help of the senior flight attendant, the other passengers watched with a mixture of respect and admiration. They all knew they were part of a story that would be discussed for days to come. A powerful reminder that character and dignity often speak louder than titles or positions. The airline's corporate headquarters was already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. In the crisis management room, phones rang constantly as social media notifications pinged like raindrops in a storm. The incident had exploded online faster than anyone could have predicted. "The videos reached 5 million views," announced a young PR specialist, her coffee growing cold beside her keyboard. "We're getting calls from every major news network." Her screen showed dozens of notifications from journalists requesting comments. The chief communications officer paced the room, his tie slightly loosened after hours of emergency meetings. "What do we have from the airport cameras?" he asked, knowing that every angle of this story needed to be verified and addressed. A technical analyst pulled up the security footage on the main screen. "We have clear views from 3 different cameras," he reported. "The gate area, the jet bridge, and the cabin cameras all confirm the passengers' accounts." The footage played silently on the wall, showing the incident from multiple angles, each view more damaging than the last. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Thompson's office was handling its own storm of media attention. His assistant's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the first video went viral. News vans had already started gathering outside the building, hoping to catch a statement from the president's chief medical advisor about his father's treatment. Back at the airline's headquarters, the head of customer relations watched as #VeteranRespect and #AirlineBias dominated social media trends. "We're seeing comments from veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and medical professionals," she reported. "This isn't just going away." The airline's CEO had just finished an emergency video call with the board of directors. "Get me our diversity training records," he demanded. "I want to know everything about this flight attendant's history with the airline." His voice carried the weight of someone who knew this incident could define their company's reputation for years to come. In a smaller office down the hall, 2 HR managers were reviewing Ms. Wilson's personnel file. "There are 3 previous complaints about unprofessional conduct," one noted grimly. "All filed within the last 2 years, all involving similar situations with minority passengers." The other manager shook her head, wondering how these incidents hadn't raised more red flags earlier. The airline's social media team was working overtime, trying to respond to thousands of comments and messages. "People are sharing their own stories of discrimination on flights," a team member reported. "This is bringing up years of similar incidents across multiple airlines." A senior board member, watching the situation unfold from his office in Chicago, made a direct call to the CEO. "This isn't just about one flight attendant or one incident anymore," he said, his voice grave. "We need to address the systemic issues this has revealed." In the medical community, support for Dr. Thompson was overwhelming. The American Medical Association released a statement expressing concern about the treatment of minorities in public spaces, particularly veterans who had served their country. Hospitals where Dr. Thompson had given lectures began sharing their own messages of support. By early afternoon, the airline's legal team had drafted a preliminary response. "We need to acknowledge the gravity of this situation," the lead counsel advised. "A simple apology won't be enough. We need concrete actions and real changes." The training department was already pulling together proposals for enhanced sensitivity and anti-bias programs. "We should have veterans involved in developing these materials," suggested a training coordinator. "Their perspective is crucial for preventing incidents like this in the future." As the corporate machine whirred into action, security footage from the flight continued to circulate online. Each new share brought fresh waves of outrage and calls for change. Comments poured in from around the world, many sharing similar experiences or expressing support for both Mr. Anderson and his son. The airline's customer service centers were overwhelmed with calls. Many passengers were calling not to complain, but to share their own stories of witnessing discrimination during air travel. Each call added another piece to a puzzle that revealed a larger problem in the industry. In the crisis management room, the team watched as Dr. Thompson's office finally released a brief statement. "While I am deeply concerned about the treatment my father received, this incident highlights the ongoing challenges faced by minorities and veterans in our country. We must do better." The measured response, characteristic of Dr. Thompson's public communications, somehow made the airline's position even more precarious. As the day wore on, the incident had clearly become more than just a viral video or a PR crisis. It had sparked a national conversation about respect, dignity, and the treatment of veterans and minorities in everyday situations. The airline found itself at the center of a movement for change that would reshape their entire industry's approach to customer service and employee training. Ms. Wilson sat in her small apartment, staring at the television screen in disbelief. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications since she'd been escorted off the plane, but she couldn't bring herself to look at any of them. The morning news was playing footage of the incident for what felt like the 100th time. A distinguished Air Force veteran, father of the president's chief medical advisor, was physically confronted by an airline employee during boarding, the news anchor reported. The incident has sparked nationwide outrage and calls for airline reform. She sank deeper into her couch, her crisp flight attendant uniform hanging untouched in the closet. The airline had placed her on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, but she knew her 15-year career might already be over. Her hands trembled as she picked up her tablet, finally forcing herself to read some of the social media comments. The first post she saw was from a veterans group. "This is how they treat those who served our country. Disgraceful." Another comment came from a medical professional. "Dr. Thompson has dedicated his life to improving healthcare for all Americans, and this is how his father is treated. Unacceptable." Her doorbell rang, making her jump. It was a delivery person with another certified letter from the airline's HR department. This one detailed the schedule for her upcoming disciplinary hearing and listed the evidence they would be reviewing, including her previous incident reports that she'd hoped would stay buried in her personnel file. The television continued its coverage. They were now showing Mr. Anderson's military service record, 25 years in the Air Force, multiple commendations, volunteer work with veterans organizations. Each new detail made her actions seem even more inexcusable. Her sister called for the third time that day. "You need to make a public statement," she insisted when Ms. Wilson finally answered. "People need to hear your side of the story." But what was her side? The security footage showed everything clearly: her impatience, her aggression, her bias. Later that afternoon, her union representative visited. "The company wants you to attend sensitivity training," he explained, shuffling through paperwork on her coffee table. "They're also requesting you participate in their new diversity awareness program if you want any chance of staying with the airline." Ms. Wilson nodded numbly, remembering other incidents from her past. The time she'd made assumptions about a Middle Eastern passenger's seat assignment. The occasion she doubted a young Hispanic woman's first-class ticket. The moment she ignored an elderly Asian couple's request for assistance with their bags. Each memory now felt like a weight pressing down on her conscience. Her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, brought over dinner that evening. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said kindly, setting down a casserole dish. "The question is, what do you learn from them?" The words hung in the air as Ms. Wilson picked at her food, barely tasting it. As night fell, she found herself writing and rewriting a public apology. "I deeply regret my actions," she typed, then deleted it. "I should have known better." Backspace. Nothing seemed adequate. How do you apologize for showing the world your worst self? The next morning, her phone lit up with a news alert. Dr. Thompson was giving a press conference about healthcare initiatives, and reporters had asked about the incident. His response was characteristically graceful. "My father taught me that how we treat others reflects who we are as people." This incident isn't just about him, it's about recognizing the dignity in every person we meet. Ms. Wilson watched the press conference twice, struck by the contrast between Dr. Thompson's composure and her own behavior. She thought about her first day as a flight attendant 15 years ago, when she'd been so excited to help people and make their journeys better. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost sight of that purpose. Her union representative called again. "The airline's offering you a chance to meet with Mr. Anderson privately," he said. "To apologize in person, but only if you complete their new training program first." The opportunity felt both terrifying and necessary. Looking out her apartment window at the planes taking off from the nearby airport, Ms. Wilson made a decision. She opened her laptop and began researching organizations that worked on bias awareness and veterans issues. If she was going to apologize, she wanted it to be more than just words. The day ended with another news cycle, but this time Ms. Wilson watched it differently. Instead of seeing herself as the victim of a viral incident, she began to understand her role in a larger conversation about respect, dignity, and the unconscious biases that can poison even routine interactions. Her journey of redemption would be long and challenging, but as she finally began responding to messages and accepting help from those around her, she realized it was a necessary one. The incident had exposed not just her actions, but a deeper problem that existed throughout society. one that could only be fixed when people were willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to become better. 2 weeks after the incident, the airline's main training center was buzzing with activity. The CEO stood before a room full of airline executives, union representatives, and civil rights leaders. Large screens displayed the new training programs being developed, while veterans advocates and diversity experts sat around the conference table, ready to share their insights. "We're not here just to fix one incident," the CEO announced, his voice carrying the weight of recent events. "We're here to change how our entire industry approaches customer service and human dignity." The room fell silent as security footage from the infamous flight played on the screens. Mr. Anderson had surprised everyone by declining to file a lawsuit. Instead, he'd offered something more valuable: his help in developing better training programs for airline staff. "My years in the Air Force taught me that real change comes from education, not punishment," he told the airline's board of directors during a virtual meeting. In Washington, Dr. Thompson was using his platform to address larger issues. "What happened to my father happens to people every day," he said during a healthcare conference. "But most of them don't have viral videos or influential children to bring attention to their stories." His words sparked discussions in Congress about transportation industry regulations. Back at the airline's headquarters, the customer service department was undergoing a complete overhaul. "We're reviewing every complaint from the past 5 years," explained the head of customer relations, "looking for patterns we might have missed." Staff members worked through stacks of reports, identifying common issues and potential solutions. The training center's walls now displayed new posters: "Every passenger has a story," and "Respect is our first service." Flight attendants in training watched role-playing scenarios and participated in workshops led by diversity experts and veteran service members. A young flight attendant trainee raised her hand during one session. "What if we're having a really stressful day?" she asked. "How do we make sure we don't let that affect how we treat passengers?" Her question led to a meaningful discussion about stress management and professional behavior. The airline's new training video featured real passengers sharing their experiences. "I was afraid to fly with my service dog," one veteran admitted on screen. "I worried about how crew members would react." His story helped staff understand the anxiety many passengers carry with them onto flights. In the break room, seasoned flight attendants discussed the changes with new trainees. "We've always had diversity training," one veteran crew member explained, "but now we're learning about the real impact of our actions. It's not just about rules, it's about people." The airline's social media team shared updates about their progress. "Today we trained our 1,000th employee under the new program," they posted. Comments poured in from around the world, many sharing their own stories of how air travel had changed since the incident. Other airlines took notice. Industry publications ran stories about the transformation. "Leading the way in customer respect," read one headline. Competing airlines began reviewing their own training programs, not wanting to risk similar incidents. Dr. Thompson's office received hundreds of letters from people inspired by his father's response to the incident. "Your father's dignity in the face of disrespect taught me how to handle my own situations better," wrote one veteran. These letters were collected and shared with airline staff during training sessions. The airline's boarding procedures were revised to reduce stress for both passengers and crew members. "We added extra time for elderly passengers and those needing assistance," explained a gate agent. "It costs us a few minutes per flight, but the improvement in customer satisfaction is worth it." In the employee break room, a photo was posted showing Mr. Anderson speaking to a group of new flight attendants. Below it, a quote read, "Every interaction is an opportunity to show someone they matter." Staff members often paused to read it before starting their shifts. Transportation industry experts began studying the airline's transformation. "They turned a crisis into an opportunity for real change," noted one analyst. "It's becoming a model for how companies can address systemic issues." At the end of another training day, a group of flight attendants gathered to share their experiences. "I used to think these situations were just about following rules," one admitted. "Now I understand they're about seeing the humanity in every passenger." The story of what happened on Flight 2317 became required reading for new airline employees across the country. But more importantly, it became a reminder that behind every ticket, Every seat number and every interaction was a human being with their own story, their own dignity, and their own right to respect. 6 months after the incident that changed an industry, the airline's main training center buzzed with anticipation. Mr. Anderson stood at the podium, looking out at a room filled with both new and veteran flight attendants. The same room where he'd once been disrespected now held the promise of positive change. "Good morning," he began, his voice warm and steady. "6 months ago, I was just another passenger trying to store his bag." A gentle ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. "Today, I'm here to talk about how a difficult moment became an opportunity for growth." In the front row, Ms. Whittleson sat quietly. She'd completed extensive sensitivity training and counseling, working hard to understand and address her biases. This would be her first time speaking publicly about the incident alongside the man she'd wronged. The audience watched as security footage from that day played on the screen behind them. But this time, it wasn't shown to shame anyone, it was used to teach. "Look at the body language," the training coordinator pointed out, nervous the assumptions being made. "These are the moments where we can choose a different path." Dr. Thompson joined virtually from his office in Washington. "My father's experience opened eyes across the country," he said through the video link. But more importantly, it opened hearts. The medical chief's words carried extra weight now, as his office had just launched a nationwide program studying how stress and bias affect both service providers and customers. A young flight attendant raised her hand during the Q&A session. "How do you stay calm when dealing with difficult situations?" she asked Mr. Anderson. His response drew knowing nods. "I remember that everyone I meet is someone's father, mother, son, or daughter. That all deserve the dignity I'd want for my own family." The airline's new training video played next, showing real examples of positive interactions between crew and passengers. "We've had a 70% reduction in customer complaints," the HR director announced proudly. "And our employee satisfaction scores have never been higher." Ms. Wilson stood up to share her story, her hands slightly shaking but her voice clear. "I thought I was just having a bad day," she admitted. "But that moment showed me biases I didn't even know I carried." Her honesty touched many in the room, especially newer staff members who worried about making similar mistakes. During the lunch break, Mr. Anderson and Ms. Wilson sat together in the cafeteria, their conversation drawing curious but respectful glances. "I never thought I'd be here," she said softly. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn and grow." His response was characteristic of his grace. "Thank you for having the courage to change." The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Veterans, elderly passengers, and people from various backgrounds participated in role-playing exercises with the flight crews. Remember, the training leader emphasized, every passenger brings their own story onto your flight. In a surprise announcement, the airline revealed the creation of a new foundation, jointly led by Mr. Anderson and his son. The Dignity in Travel initiative will ensure that what happened 6 months ago continues to create positive change, the CEO explained. The foundation would provide scholarships for minority students interested in aviation careers and support veterans entering the airline industry. The day's most powerful moment came when a group of passengers from the original flight reunited to share their perspectives. The elderly woman who'd spoken up, the businessman who'd recorded the video, the young mother with her baby, all had returned to help teach future airline staff about the importance of their actions. 6 months ago, we were strangers on a plane, the businessman reflected. Today, we're part of a movement that's changing how people treat each other, not just in the air, but everywhere. As the training session ended, new flight attendants lined up to shake hands with both Mr. Anderson and Ms. Wilson. Each interaction represented a small moment of healing, understanding, and hope for the future. Outside the training center, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Mr. Anderson paused to watch an airplane take off, its lights blinking steadily as it rose into the evening sky. "Every flight is a fresh start," he said to no one in particular. "Every interaction is a chance to show someone they matter." The story of Flight 2317 had become more than just a viral video or a corporate crisis. It had grown into a lesson about human dignity, the courage to change, and the power of turning a negative moment into positive transformation. In airports across the country, new signs now read, "Every journey begins with respect," a simple reminder that behind every ticket, every uniform, and every interaction is a human being worthy of dignity and understanding.